The Errant Apprentice, Book 1, Ghile by Kevin Hayman, read by the author. Chapter 1, The Last Dragon. It was a dream. Terry knew it was a dream because it wasn't the farm he'd called home for the last 21 years. It also wasn't Raymond, Mississippi. It might be Mississippi, but not one he knew. He stood on the edge of a high bluff overlooking a massive valley. It was filled for as far as the eye could see with one thing: kudzu. Starting about 20 feet below him, it spread infinitely to the left and right and far, far into the distance to trees in what looked like a massive forest. The sun shone in a clear blue sky. There was a light breeze that ruffled his coal-black hair. It was not nearly enough wind for what he was seeing, though. The kudzu seemed to move and undulate like a great sea of greenery. It shimmered in the sun as waves passed him in the unknowable distance. The only sound was of infinite rustling leaves. As he watched, he wondered at the sight. His uncle, Ernest, had always said that Terry was a bright boy, but not very imaginative. He learned quickly, never made the same mistake twice, and could think quicker than most. He just didn't daydream often. And when he did, it was always about real things. Things like his father. He wondered where his mind had conjured this particular vision from. Maybe he'd seen something like this when he was a kid riding the back roads with Ernest and Dottie. Maybe near Vicksburg? The waves seemed to start breaking around a shape far out in the sea of kudzu. Something started to rise. It looked like a hill was starting to emerge from the ground beneath the plants. The hill, shape, whatever, had a ridge running across the front. As it rose, Terry saw two deep caves beneath the ridge. In the center, there was a slope and, "Holy moly!" Terry said, his jaw dropping. It was a head. It was the size of a stadium, and as it rose, he saw the entire foliate face of the thing. He wasn't sure how he knew, but it was ancient, older than anything he'd ever seen or experienced. As it continued to surface, a thumping sound began at the edge of hearing. It was quiet at first, gradually became louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat getting closer. Its rise stopped right around the chin of the great thing. He gawked at it, and it seemed to stare back at him. They stayed like that for several moments. The face, the thumping that could not be denied. Right as Terry was going to open his mouth to say something, the vast face of leaves moved first. The giant mouth actually opened, and it was a marvel to see. It was horrifying. It was beautiful. The godlike face spoke. "It comes. Be strong." Terry sat bolt upright in bed. The dream faded and his mind readjusted itself to the new reality, but it was his bed in his tiny trailer on the farm. The pounding rhythm was someone banging on the door. Terry rubbed the sleep from his eyes. A sound like a muted trumpet gradually resolved itself into the voice of his Uncle Ernest shouting, "Terry, are you up, son? I need you." "It's Saturday," he yelled back. "What do you want?" The banging stopped as soon as he'd answered. "There's a booger out at Lethal's place. Showed up pretty early and tore the fields up." Terry pulled the sheet over his head. He'd been on hobgoblin patrol for the last 3 days and had been ranging over the western side of Hinds County. He was tired, and he'd been sure he was done. He thought he'd have a couple of days' rest. "Can it at least wait till breakfast?" he shouted. He knew it wouldn't, but he thought maybe this once. There was a very long pause at the door before Ernest answered. When he did, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "It's a dragon. If it was anything else, I'd let you sleep after this week." Before Terry realized he was in motion, he was already opening the door. He met his uncle's gaze. The old man's face was lined and bearded, his hairline receding. It was a hard face, but the kind of hard you get from caring so much. Terry had to remind himself of that sometimes. "Can you help me suit up?" Terry asked. He'd put his business face on. "Yep," the old man said as Terry took the few steps to his bed and dove under it to look for parts of his armor. He heard Ernest close the door behind him as he stepped in and started rummaging around trying to find armor that wasn't where they normally kept it. "Did you let Dottie clean up in here?" the old man asked. Terry found his boots and chucked them out from under the bed along with his underclothes. He answered as he dragged himself out from under the bed. "I didn't let her do anything. She decided the trailer was a wreck and needed cleaning while I was out. You try stopping her from doing something she set her mind to." Ernest turned with the pieces of Terry's armor in his arms. What had he been doing in the closet, he thought, as Ernest started laying the armor out. He answered, "I have. I'll talk to her, though." He didn't look hopeful about it. Terry changed into his white and red undersuit, and Ernest started fastening plate armor over the top. It was old, and it belonged to Terry's father, but he loved it and cared for it. With practiced movements, they had him suited up soon enough. Before adding his outer clothes, Terry knocked on a small sigil on his left breast 3 times and activated the armor's minor enchantments. His skin cooled instantly, and a lot of the discomfort of the plate vanished. It was still working. He quickly got his tabard and jeans on over the armor as Ernest held out his duster. The duster, like his armor, had belonged to his father. It, too, had minor enchantments. The pockets of holding, for instance. He checked one and found his sword handle right where he left it. He patted it through the outside of the long coat. The sword was a thing of beauty. Golden crossguard with 3 gems, 2 red on either side of a large blue one embedded. The blade was nearly white and seemed to draw in and amplify light. It was obviously enchanted. It was unbreakable and never dulled. It had, on several occasions, done more than that. The other pocket of holding held the only firearm the Order of St. George allowed him, the Mercy. A pistol in name only, it fired huge caliber bullets and had a kick like a mule. It was a 2-handed weapon at the best of times. At the worst of times, it was a 3-handed weapon. It often dislocated shoulders. The knight's last resort, it was often called. Ernest looked him up and down. "Not bad. 5 minutes this time. Let's roll." Terry nodded, and they ran out to the truck. It was a 10-minute drive toward Learned to reach Lethal's place, and Terry spent his time behind the wheel trying to come up with tactics. It was useless at this stage, though. There was information he needed before he could get anything solid. "Okay," he said to his uncle. "What do we know so far?" Ernest had been staring out the window, watching the world go by in the early morning light, but he snapped back to himself at Terry's question. "It's a red dragon, and Lethal says it's a doozy. Probably the size of a school bus. Biggest you ever been up against." He shook his head. "Damn thing mated his tractor into the ground and pushed it all around the field. After that, he started eating his cattle like a box of chocolates." "Chocolates?" Terry asked with a raised eyebrow. Ernest shrugged. "Takes a bite out of one, puts it back, bites into another, puts it back, bites another. You get the idea. It's tasting them." "They're cows," Terry said. "Don't they all taste the same?" Ernest gave him a flat look. "I don't know nothing about dragons except how to kill 'em. You're the expert on the damn things." Ernest squinted at Terry, which made him feel nervous. "You got a plan yet?" Terry found himself grinning. "Yep," was all he said. The silence stretched for an uncomfortable moment before Ernest snapped. "And?" "And," said Terry, "I'll be fine." "You're sure?" Still grinning, Terry just nodded. He was lying. Terry despised lying, but in this case he didn't want to worry his uncle. If he was being honest with himself, he was so nervous he should have been vibrating. He couldn't think clearly. This was the 3rd dragon. The 3rd dragon. He'd been waiting for this. Well, not specifically this, but something like this. Ernest had to know. He kept track of Terry's tally as closely as Terry did himself. His time as a squire was almost up. He could take a new title after this. He could start working toward becoming a knight after this, like his father. Everyone knew about his father locally, but no one talked about him locally. All he knew was that his father had been a hero, but had died. He died facing a dragon. Terry gripped the steering wheel and tried not to shake them off the road. A short time later, the truck turned off the main road and wound its way down the dirt track leading to Lethal's house. They passed the house and headed straight for the pastures and fields beyond. There was a small rise there, and Terry stopped the truck at the top so Ernest would have a good view of the action. Terry may be doing the work, but he needed a licensed steward, and that was Sir Ernest. He'd never made it as a real knight, but he was considered a fair trainer. And this was it, the final exam. He was here to make sure Terry lived up to the codes, was competent enough to be a knight, and above all else, that he was safe. He was still nervous as he got out of the truck. As Terry double-checked his weapon pockets, Ernest hopped up and sat on the hood of the truck. The old man whistled. "Now that," he said, "is a big sumbitch." Terry looked, and it was, indeed, a huge, red dragon. Head to rump, the thing actually was the size of a school bus, all of 40 feet. The tail added another 10 on top of that. He, and it was now obviously a he, was also vigorously going to town on the remains of a red tractor like he was the last of his species. Terry scratched the back of his head and looked at the rest of the field. There were half-cows scattered around and huge deep ruts gouged into the ground. It looked like someone had drunkenly tried to recreate the battlefields of World War I down there. "You made it," a voice said behind the both of them. Terry spun and Ernest looked over his shoulder. Lethal was an older man, older than Ernest. He was skinny, but the kind of skinny you get after having rapidly lost weight. The man had been sick a long time. Even with that and the kindness of his neighbors, he was a complete grump. Like most of the men out here, he wore a full beard. Some kind of fashion thing picked up from the dwarves in town. Ernest nodded to him. "Can't sit by the phone in armor waiting on your cows to get eaten, can he?" He turned to watch the dragon at its noisy lovemaking. "Besides, this'll be over quick enough." Lethal came around the front of the truck and looked like he was going to say something infuriating. He usually did. Terry simply marched himself down the hill and approached the dragon as it collapsed the engine compartment of the man's tractor in a fit of passion. The thing's back was to him. Mating season for saurians, Terry thought as he squatted down into a crouched run at the bottom of the rise. The dragon was raking its claws along the side of the destroyed farm equipment, and Terry stopped beside one of the lawn trenches left by the sliding tractor. He thought about his next move. He didn't want to take chances. No showboating. No theatrics. Do this quick and clean. Well, quick and dirty in this case. He reached for the mercy. Terry stood to his full height and leveled the oversized pistol in one hand at the dragon's left flank. The dragon still hadn't looked up. He just kept grinding. Terry said a silent prayer and braced his shoulder for what was about to happen. He fired. The gun, as usual, kicked hard, but Terry got it lowered and sighted again quickly. He fired 4 more times at the thing. It finally looked up. The bullets had done nothing. "You forgot the stupid scales," he thought, as the massive head swung and a green eye zeroed in on him. The neck on the dragon inflated like a bullfrog, and Terry gulped. He knew what this was. It was mixing chemicals in its neck sac, and as soon as it opened its mouth, it was going to blast him with fire. He turned and dove into a trench just as flames singed the hem of his coat. He rolled and sat back to the trench side and panted as the flames continued above him. So much for that idea. The flames stopped. He peeked over the scorched top of the trench and saw the dragon was panting as well. It was trying to inflate its neck sac again, but it would take time for the chemical glands to refill. Not long, though. His mind raced. What was the solution here? He reviewed what he knew about red dragons as quickly as he could. Amorous, violent, vain, hoarders. There it was. He fished in his pockets, trying not to rush himself into a panic. There, he thought, 39 cents. Not much, but it would do on a sunny day like today. Was his life worth 39 cents? May as well find out. He stood and stepped over the rim of the trench. "Hey!" he shouted. The dragon looked at him and leapt from the tractor finally. It began a slow run towards him. He tossed his change to his left and yelled, "Fetch!" The sun glinted off the coins as they spun through the air, and the dragon skidded to a halt. Its head swung to follow the coins, and the darn thing bounced up and down a couple of times, seeming excited. It looked at Terry, looked toward where the coins fell, back at Terry, and then back at the coins. Terry didn't give it a chance to turn back. He closed the distance in a burst of speed, his sword already in his hands, the handle seeming to extend to fit them both. He dropped to his bottom and slid directly between the great beast's front claws until he came to a stop between its pectoral plates. With a shout, he thrust the sword between the two all the way to the bejeweled hilt. The dragon threw its head back and screamed as blood and foul-smelling chemicals ran from the sides of its mouth. Terry scrambled out from underneath, barely pulling his sword free as the thing's legs gave out and it collapsed straight down and then onto its side. The neck fell like a tree in the forest and the head bounced against the ground. He stood there, staring at it for a long moment, trying to catch his breath. "I did it," he said. It felt so good to say he said it again. "I did it!" He threw his hands in the air. He turned and waved to his uncle, who was standing on the front bumper of the truck and whooping like a madman. Terry tried to wipe the grin from his face as he cleaned his sword with a cloth from his pocket. He turned back to the dragon and knelt to pray. He plunged the tip of his sword into the ground and began. "Holy Father, I thank you for the—" "Do that later," Ernest yelled. "Cut off the head, let's get to town." Terry sighed heavily and stood. Ernest never showed the proper respect. This was going to be very, very messy. Chapter 2. The Nitty-Gritty. It took about 30 minutes to drain the head of the dragon of blood. Terry had grabbed some rope from the truck, and thanks to the horns and protuberances on the snout, it was easy to loop the rope. He hung it from a lower branch on the sole tree in the field, and he sat there watching the red blood leak from the neck while Ernest discussed payment over a beer with Lethal. They both left him to it. This was one of the things they don't tell you about in the pulp novels the Order of St. George published. None of the stories about Sir Alfred McAlpine talked about the nitty-gritty day-to-day stuff. Terry knew he was lucky to have been raised to become a knight instead of coming to it later. He'd been exposed to all this early. He already knew about the hard parts. It also was something you kept out of the public eye. The average person out there in the wide world probably knew this sort of thing went on. They just didn't want to think about it. That's what knights do. They protect people. They protect them from monsters, sure, but they also protect them from the harsh realities behind the scenes. Ever since magic returned in 75, the world had needed protectors. The bickering over jurisdiction led to absolute chaos until the church stepped in and volunteered to set up the Order of St. George. Now, anyone willing to go through the training, serve their time as a squire, then an errant apprentice, and swear the peace and truce of God, could become either a knight protector or a knight errant and keep people safe. It was what Terry's dad had done. He smiled at that. He wondered if his dad would be happy that his son had followed in his footsteps. He wondered what his mother would say. Would they be proud that Terry had sworn the Peatog as soon as he was old enough to understand the words at the tender age of 6? That he'd been throwing himself into danger since then? That Ernest and Dottie had resigned themselves to the inevitability of it and done their best to see he had the training he needed? He wondered a lot of things about his father. He completely lost track of time until he heard a loud and long expletive from Lethal and a beer can get crushed behind him. God damn, you drive a hard bargain, Ernie, he was saying. Don't call me Ernie, you idiot, he heard Ernest reply. You're lucky I didn't charge more. The kid needed this one. Otherwise, we might not have come out here at all. Terry saw that the blood had finally stopped seeping from the neck, and the grass beneath had grown greener and longer. It was done. He tuned them out and unhitched the rope from the limb and got the head lowered to the ground. He unfastened it, and grabbing it by the horns, he lifted it onto his back. He walked by the two bickering old men, who ignored him, and dropped the massive thing into the bed of the truck. It made a terrible sound as it strained the old Ford's suspension. That shut the both of them up finally. Well, Ernest said, looking from Terry back to Lethal, I'd say this has been fun, but I don't think I can manage a lie that big with a straight face. See you in church, Lethal. Lethal slammed a check down on the hood and grumbled his way out of the field as quickly as he could and still maintained some dignity. Ernest pocketed the check and watched him go. Maybe that was too far, Ernest said to the man's back. Terry walked up, checking the back of his duster for bloodstains, but he found none. He watched Lethal walk off, mumbling to himself. Maybe, but it's a truth. He's a terrible grump. He grinned at Ernest. Besides, I believe you made him so mad he left the rest of his six-pack. Ernest looked shocked and finally noticed the beer sitting on the other side of the hood. Hot damn, kid, you may have just salvaged this morning. About 20 minutes later, Terry parked the truck in front of the old train depot in downtown Raymond. Around 1985, it had been converted into a way station for the Knights of St. George. A dwarf named Dwumbra ran the place. He did maintenance on equipment and ran a machine shop in the back for working on motorcycles. Not many knights came through the area anymore, but when they did, they were surprised to find something so large and full service. Dwumbra himself was an odd duck for a dwarf. He had a dark blue, almost black beard and hair that he kept combed over one eye, and had adopted a goth aesthetic. He never said why he'd abandoned his people in New Mexico, but he seemed happy, and by that point he'd been in town so long he was a regular. The locals liked Dwumbra. Terry managed to hoist the severed dragon's head onto his back and lugged it straight through the front double doors into the way station. Dwumbra, sitting behind the counter, looked up in shock. Holy hell, kid, that's number 3, isn't it? Terry grinned. It is. Can you add it to the tally and let me know how much it earned? He should have felt bad for taking money from Lethal and then taking money from the order, but one was for Ernest for services rendered. This was just for him. Dwumbra waved him over to his large scales at the end of the wooden counter. Terry slung the head over his shoulder onto the large flat plate, trying not to let the insides fall out of the neck. Dwumbra whistled. Good Lord, Terry, this thing's 80 pounds. He must have been a monster. I still don't see how you lug these things around like that. Terry blinked. I mean, it was a monster, so... Dwumbra just shook his head, smiling. Ernest stepped up to the counter to pick up the slack. He was as big as a school bus if it was anything. I'm impressed. Ernest clapped Terry on the shoulder. Not gonna lie, Dwum, I'm proud of the boy. Terry grinned like an idiot. His uncle could be sparing with praise, but this was special. They both knew it. Dwumbra walked back over to his desk, which had been the ticket counter, and pulled out a calculator. He started typing in numbers with his stubby fingers. He looked up as Terry and Ernest came back to their side of the counter. How long was it when it was in one piece? He asked. 50, maybe 52 feet with the tail? Terry said, looking to Ernest for verification. Ernest simply nodded. Dwumbra typed some more numbers, shaking his head, then grabbed a scratch pad to jot down some figures. Probably filled up on the heifers, too. I think we can fudge that into the probable weight, he mumbled. His brow furrowed and his mumbles became mutters. Terry tried to get a look at what he was writing and typing, but Dwumbra curled his arm around the paper and turned, blocking it and the calculator without looking up. After several minutes of furious scribbling and punching at the calculator, he finally came up with a number. His eyes widened. "Hey," he said, "can you take a check?" "Why?" asked Terry. Dwumber ran his fingers through his hair and puffed out his cheeks for a second. "Honestly, I don't keep this kind of cash on hand." Ernest whooped and slapped his knee. "This calls for a celebration," he said, and held up the beers Lethal had left on the truck. "Here, here," Dwumber shouted and jumped up on the counter to grab a can from the plastic ring. Ernest held the dangling cans up to Terry, who shook his head. No thanks, I don't drink," was all he said. He normally didn't like people drinking much around him, but this was an exception. "Uncle Ernest, you can have mine. I'm driving back anyway." It was a quiet and awkward drive back to the house from town. The facts hung in the air between Terry and Ernest. They both knew this was likely the last time they'd be doing this together. On top of that, there was something Terry desperately needed to ask him before all this came to an end. He glanced over at Ernest. The older man was staring out the passenger side window, seemingly deep in thought. He also had the last beer open in his hand. "Open container law in Mississippi, Unc," Terry said. Ernest looked at him, took the can, and chugged the entire thing in one go before throwing it out the open window. He let out a long, low, loud belch and wiped his hands together. "What container?" he said with a grin. Terry sighed. It wasn't the littering that bothered him. The garbage gnomes would have the can carried off before the hour was out. No, what bothered Terry was that Ernest was obviously trying to avoid the situation. There was nothing for it. He was just going to have to ask him. "Uncle Ernest," he began, but before he could continue, he was interrupted. "Wait," Ernest said. "I know what you're going to ask, but I don't want to talk about it right now. After dinner, okay? I promise. After dinner, I'll tell you everything you want to know. Just let me sober up first. This is gonna be a lot." Terry nodded. "Okay, thank you." He thought it would have been more difficult than this. Ernest had this habit of surprising people, though. He'd seem like a backwater yokel and then just show a depth of understanding that would leave you speechless. A few minutes later, they pulled into the dirt drive in front of the house, and there on the porch was his Aunt Dottie. She was of an age with Ernest. Where Ernest was tall and lean, Dottie was short and stout. Ernest had trained Terry with a sword and shield, but it was Dottie that taught him how to wrestle and fight. She was smiling now. Terry and Ernest got out of the truck, and as he walked up, she said what she always said when she saw him first thing in the morning. "Oh, no, not you again." The smile never left her face, and she opened her arms wide for a hug. Terry jogged up and gave her a bear hug, which she returned. He squeezed her tightly, and Dottie looked up at him. "There he is. My boy's all grown up now." The smile slipped from Terry's face. Today was going to be the beginning of a lot of lasts. Terry began, but didn't know where to go from there. He settled lamely on, "I love you, Aunt Dottie." It seemed to be the right thing to say. She squeezed him until his back popped and Terry groaned. Dottie let go and turned to the house. "If you want lunch, I'm going to need some help with it." She watched Ernest take careful steps toward the porch. "Well, not both of you, I guess." She walked in, leaving Terry on the porch. He turned and looked at Ernest. "You good?" he asked his uncle. "Yeah, I just got to sit in the recliner for a bit. You go help your aunt." Terry nodded and ran inside, but heard his uncle yell after him, "No armor in the kitchen!" Terry slapped his forehead and ran straight through the hall, the dining room, the kitchen, out the back door, into his trailer to get changed before he spent the day doing chores with his aunt. He was going to try and enjoy today. He wanted to burn this into his memory. At dinner that night, Ernest was quiet. Dottie talked like everything was normal and asked about the dragon and Lethal and how things went with Dwumbra. Terry, for his part, tried to stay positive, and he mostly succeeded until Ernest asked him a question. "How are you gonna go?" Terry blinked. In all of his thoughts about leaving home, he'd never actually gotten that far. As an errant apprentice, he needed a steed, some kind of vehicle he could use in combat, and to get around. Most knights used a motorcycle. Terry didn't have that kind of money. Well, he did at the moment, but not even wanted to eat afterwards. "Honestly, I hadn't thought about it," he said, his face starting to burn with embarrassment. He finished his dinner and started pushing a single English pea around the plate, trying not to meet Ernest's eyes. He looked up as Dottie spoke. "I'm sure we can think of something, but that's for tomorrow," she said with a smile. It made Terry suspicious. It was the kind of thing she said at Christmas about things he might get as a gift if he was good and Santa came. Well, before Santa had to be taken down a few years ago. Ernest nodded. "Yeah, I suppose you're right. Terry, when you're done with the dishes, meet me on the front porch." And with that, he stood up, walked past Terry out the door, turned, and left. Terry heard the front screen door open and close on its rusty spring. Terry looked at Dottie. "Would it be okay if we went ahead and got the dishes now?" She smiled sadly. "Of course." She stood, but stopped in the act of gathering plates. "Go easy on him, Terry. This won't be easy for him. It was your father, but it was his brother." Terry stood. "I guess he did know him longer than me," he said as he started clearing dishes. Dottie touched his arm. "None of that. You'll feel better once you two talk." Terry nodded and took plates into the kitchen for washing. The sun had started to set by the time Terry had finished the dishes with Dottie. He felt nervous. This was it. He slowly walked to the front door and looked out. Ernest sat on the concrete front steps of the porch and watched the sun begin its slow descent behind the trees across the road. Terry didn't know what sort of mood he was going to find, but the only way forward was to take the first steps. He opened the screen. Ernest looked over his shoulder at the sound of the screen door. He nodded to the steps next to him and scooted over. Terry took the offered seat. He thought about saying something, asking about his father. He even thought of a few jokes to break the ice. He decided the best thing to do was to let Ernest tell the story in his own time. After a moment, Ernest found the words. "Do you know how hard it is to look at you sometimes, son?" What? Ernest shook his head. He started to fidget with his wristwatch. "That came out wrong. I mean, that you look so much like Glenn, it hurts sometimes." I was the last person to see him. "Right before the dragon?" he asked. "No," Ernest replied. "I saw him die, Terry. I saw my brother die to that dragon." There was another long pause. Terry was stunned. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "I didn't want you to," was all he said as he twisted the knob on the old watch. Are you ashamed of him?" "What?" Ernest snapped his head up, glaring at Terry. "My dad. Are you ashamed of him for screwing up and getting killed by the dragon? Is that why you don't talk about him?" All the emotion drained from Ernest's face as his gaze drifted off somewhere behind Terry. "Ashamed? No. No, son. Your daddy ended himself, really. He just used a dragon to do it." Terry stared at his uncle as if locusts had started crawling out of his ears. Ernest focused on Terry again as if coming back from a long trip into the past. He turned back to stare at the road. He seemed to steel himself for something. After a minute, he nodded and began. "Your father was the best knight in the state. I washed out of training early. He met Marie, that was your mother, and moved off the farm to be closer to town after they got married. I didn't see him nearly as much after that. Terry remained silent. Anything he said might break whatever this mood was his uncle was in. The story might stop. When Marie died of the cancer, well, Glenn didn't recover. He just sit for hours and stare off into space. Dottie started spending more and more time at Glenn's to take care of you since you weren't even a year old by then. Glenn couldn't. He was barely taking care of himself. Terry blinked. His dad had abandoned him? Don't get me wrong, Glenn loved you. He loved you as much as a father could love a boy, but losing Marie, well, I think that's when he really died. He was just a body walking around without a soul after that. It broke him. Hindsight lets you see stuff like that, you know. Curse getting old. Ernest continued fiddling with his watch, his brow furrowed. Terry could tell this was hurting him. He'd wanted to know, but, Uncle Ernest, if this hurts too much, we can... No, he said. I gotta do this. Dottie says it's killing me to hold it in, and she's right. Usual. Ernest stared at the watch face as he spun the hands around and around. Again, he seemed to leave the here and now. I probably should have seen what happened next coming, but I thought it'd get better. He's my brother. But he always seemed so much stronger than me. He kept her paw off of me when he'd been drinking. Hid me from the worst of it. Dragged me out with his friends to keep me away from the house all the time until Pa died. His friends couldn't stand me, but he brought me anyway. Man was a hero from the day he was born. Terry swallowed hard to try to get the lump in his throat down. He used his fingertips to clear tears from his eyes that he swore weren't there a minute ago. He didn't trust himself to say anything yet. I thought he'd be okay. It'd just take time. Then he brought you to the house one day with your crib and toys and everything in the truck bed and brought it all into the living room. Dottie was worried and I was confused. He was nervous. Couldn't focus. Just kept saying, "Watch my boy," until Dottie agreed to. Ernest looked to the sky as the first stars began to twinkle to life. Lightning bugs started appearing. The symphony of a southern night began as crickets and frogs started singing. Dottie promised to watch you, and when he walked out, she told me to follow him. Didn't take a lot of convincing on her part. I let him get the truck a little ways down the road before I followed him. I parked on the backside of the courthouse in Raymond and ran around to that big roundabout where the water tower is. What did you see? Terry asked in an ear whisper. Ernest's hands started to shake and the twisting on his watch dial became more violent. They'd cleared the town out. The dragon was rampaging and starting fires. Some kids from town had found its nest, you see. There's these eggs. The dial snapped off. Ernest finally looked back at it. Seemed to give a single laugh. The boys smashed those eggs. It was maybe an hour later, the dragon charged into town wanting an eye for an eye. Started going after the children. That's why Glenn was in such a hurry. He needed you safe, and he needed to get out there. I didn't find out about the eggs till later, of course. Terry held out his hand. Ernest turned and looked at it in confusion. A second later, he seemed to get it. He took off his watch and handed it to Terry, along with the dial. Terry started working to reattach it. Ernest faced the road again as the last hints of a light blue sky vanished behind the trees, leaving them with an early spring night sky. Like I said, they cleared the town. Glenn needed room to work and not worry about lives. I came up the sidewalk running just in time to see him run up to that dragon right as it started to fill its bladders to shoot. Ernest's voice became raspy and quiet. Your daddy was the best in the state. Like I said, maybe the country. People still talk about him out there. There's a lot of things he could have done to take that dragon down and been safe and sound, but, well, his voice caught and he cleared his throat. He didn't care anymore. Just gave up living months ago. Ran up to that dragon with its neck pouch all full of fire, and he stuck his sword, your sword, straight into it. Terry stared at Ernest with his jaw hanging. If his dad had pierced a dragon's neck right before breathing fire, then it exploded, Terry said. Ernest grinned. Rip that thing wide open. It would have been glorious if Glenn hadn't been standing right there under it when it blew. The only two things left was his coat and the truck and his sword. Didn't have a mark on it. Wasn't even hot. Terry ran his fingers through his hair and turned away from Ernest. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. He just let the moment stretch and watched lightning bugs. It was a little bit before Ernest spoke again. I saw it, boy. I was the only one that did see it. I told the mayor Glenn zigged when he should have zagged, but still managed to kill the beast. Terry sat stock still and stared at the sky, his mind reeling. Now, before you say anything, Ernest said, people didn't know about that kind of sadness back then. It was seen as a sign of weakness, or said he was crazy around here, and I wasn't going to have that. Your daddy was a hero. He was broken, but he was still a hero. Terry smiled. Of course Ernest would have tried to protect his brother's reputation. I tried filling in for him, Ernest continued. I just wasn't that good. I understood everything in practice, but these ankles and my knees and my back, I wasn't worth a darn. Found a guy from down near Pickens to take over Glenn's territory. He was a jackass, but he got the job done. I'd only left one more thing to take care of. Terry turned and looked at Ernest in the faint light from the now lit windows. Tears leaked down Ernest's face, but he met Terry's eyes. In that moment, Terry's understanding of his uncle changed. What was left? He asked, handing the repaired watch back. You, boy. One thing in my life I probably didn't screw up. Terry grabbed his uncle in an embrace and buried his face in his shoulder. All he could do after that was mumble thank you over and over as they held each other for the first time in years. Neither of them noticed Dottie standing in the doorway watching through the screen door.